On October 3rd of 2011, a 2-year-old girl named Wang Yu was crossing a street in a Chinese city called Foshan. She walked across the busy street, a van hits her, then pauses, then continues over top of her as if nothing happened. As she lay bleeding in the middle of the road, a whopping 18 people walked by her. 18 people walked by her. Some are curious of her fatal situation, but most are completely unbothered by the cries of a dying toddler. It took 18 people for one to finally help. The 19th saw Wang Yu and quickly called for help, but it was too little too late. Wang Yu died, tragically, in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. The question that Chinese authorities had to grapple with was what exactly killed Wang Yu? The driver of the van was physically responsible for the injuries that caused her death, but every one of the 18 people that walked by her pushed her coffin a little further into the ground. The driver harmed her for sure, but it was the people, the societal microcosm of Foshan, that killed her. I first heard the story from my freshman year humanities teacher, and when he told me, I didn't believe it. I couldn't believe that not one, not two, not three, but 18 people would rather walk home than try and dial a number to save a dying child. My disbelief of the situation prompted me to search it up on the internet, and after I found the video of the horrific event, I sat back in horror as I counted all 18 people walk by Wang Yu. As I sat there in awe, I questioned what everyone is wondering. How could 18 people justify letting a child die in the middle of the road? 2 years later, in my junior year of high school, I interviewed a Catholic priest in my community for a school project. We talked about God, the Pope, the sexual abuse scandals, the usual. I asked him about his views on homosexuality, and he responded with the all-too virtuous response of, "I'm totally fine with it, but it's still a sin." I obviously pushed back, but as we talked, I realized there was absolutely no justification for his belief independent from "because God said so." And right there, it clicked for me. I realized that the priest is able to justify his opinion on homosexuality the same way the 18 people of Foshan were able to justify their actions. They are all able to justify their actions because the people around them are doing the exact same thing. Imagine it this way. You're standing in a crowded concert floor and for whatever reason, every single person around you sits down. You don't know why, but inevitably, you will sit down along with them. It's human nature to want to fit in, and we get super uncomfortable when we stand out. This translates to how we understand morality. Those that stay standing do not comply with the collective opinion on morality and thus need to defend their opinion from the status quo. Those that sit down, they blend in with the normal. They are the status quo. But when the status quo is letting a child die in the middle of the road, or blatant homophobia, or misogyny, genocide, or systemic racism, those that stay standing are the ones that will shape a brighter future for all of us. Our personal moral compass is shaped by those who raise us. Our parents, friends, religious figures, teachers, really anyone in our community that participates in our upbringing. That's why we tend to hold similar ideological viewpoints as those closest to us. Now, what happens if you're born into a racist family? What happens if you're born into a homophobic religion? The unfortunate reality is that you most likely will adopt the morals and beliefs of those closest to you, even if they are incredibly misled. Because before there's a conscious desire to reject those ideals, there is a subconscious absorption of those same ideals. This is really at the core of what I'm talking about today, a widespread, uncontrollable, almost unchecked acceptance and practice of other people's moral codes, and as a whole, society's moral codes. Now, this idea extends far beyond those growing up in racist communities or homophobic faiths. Those of us that have grown up in, quote, relative moral normalcy, or those of us that grow up in the status quo, still participate in this blind acceptance of moral codes. Now, most of the time, these codes are arguably beneficial to humanity, but a lot are not. A hotly debated topic like meat eating is a perfect example. It's very easy to argue why humans shouldn't eat meat from the moral perspective. From the billions of lives lost to the countless hours of unnecessary torturing, killing a living being for a few moments of mouth pleasure is incredibly difficult to justify. Despite that, a lot of you watching this right now probably have not second-guessed your choice of eating animals, which is totally fine. If you were born in Denmark during the height of Viking power in 900 AD, chances are that you believed that brutal plundering and mass murdering is morally acceptable. And they would have come to that conclusion the same way we justify our consumption of meat. It's because society tells us it's okay. Now, the dangers of this are quite extensive, but they reach far beyond meat. Because society tells us what is moral and what is immoral for the most part, civilizations often enter dangerously long periods of horribly misguided moral codes. For 2,000 years, the Catholic Church has actively persecuted members of the LGBTQ+ community. And this past March, the Church reiterated their stance on homosexual matrimony and decreed that the Church cannot bless same-sex marriages. Now, it's disappointingly unsurprising given the history of the Church, but what is most frustrating is watching Pope Francis, who presented himself as an advocate for the victims of the Church, silence the voices of millions of Catholics that are trying so desperately to validate their human experience. The reason the Church needed to come out and say this in the first place is because so many Catholic organizations around the world are questioning why they can't bless same-sex marriages. And rightfully so. Questioning moral authority is at the core of what I'm talking about. But I bring up the Church because their most recent actions act as an example of how firmly set into the fabric of society some of these moral codes are, and why it is so important for us to evaluate our morality independently from society. The only way to tear down the antiquated moral values of past generations is by giving the next generation the tools to do so. We must teach children and adults all around the world how to critically evaluate what they deem on an individual level to be moral. Once an individual can evaluate their morality independently from those around them, a new generation can create a more morally sound world centered around the present, not the past. Now that sounds nice, and that is the direction we're headed, but the real difficulty is getting there. Now, I'm no moral philosopher and have little academic authority to prove to you why my moral reasoning technique is viable. But I can confidently tell you that the tools I use to connect with my morality work very well for me, and I'm confident they will for you as well. To foster a deep understanding of our morality, independent from society, we all must boil down our individual morality to a very concise, comprehensive idea. To do this effectively, I've made a morality template, so to speak. The first necessary component is an objective measurement. This is something that you can actually measure to then later deem the importance of. Now, the reason we need an objective measurement is in an attempt to ground our opinion in as much fact as possible. Our opinions on morality will change, but the constant that you base it upon will not, and that is super important. The second thing we need is a subjective inference. This is very simple, but it just asks the question of, is the objective measurement good or bad? Is something like happiness good? Is something like suffering bad? When we piece it together, we create a very clear, concise question that asks, does blank action cause blank objective measurement? Based on this template, you can insert any action into your morality chart, and it will give you an answer that most closely aligns with your moral code. For example, I'll use my moral chart that has seen many iterations, but based off where I am in my life right now, I base my moral chart off access to happiness. I believe it is immoral when my own actions hinder someone else's access to happiness. Thus, my moral chart looks a little something like this. If I was curious about buying a pair of Nike sneakers, for example, as I've done many times in the past, I would plug that action into my template. Does buying a pair of Jordans limit someone else's access to happiness? Now, the answer is unfortunately much more nuanced than it appears, but a quick Google search will tell me that Nike has knowingly used forced labor to make their apparel in China. This obviously hinders the happiness of countless individuals, so if I want to comply with my moral code, I should not buy a pair of Nike shoes. The goal of this chart is not to create rules that I must follow, but rather it's designed to bring myself closer with my morality. It's a checkpoint. It's something I can refer to that I know accurately represents what I believe to be moral. Now, acting in true accordance with our moral values is incredibly difficult, and I don't claim to be morally perfect just because I filled out my morality template. The first step of living a life in accordance with our moral codes is recognizing when you have breached those codes. And the only way to know if you have breached those codes is if I have properly set up the rules in advance. Now, I don't want you to walk out of here today and slap yourself on the wrist every time you do something that doesn't comply with your moral code. But I want you to consciously begin fostering a relationship with your morality completely independent from those around you. Next time you buy a plastic water bottle, or order a burger, or vote for a racist politician, ask yourself, is this action in line with what I deem to be moral? If the answer is yes, then continue it. By all means, nobody's going to stop you. But if the answer is no, critically ask yourself, why am I continuing to do this action? I'll finish by saying this. If we can all individually connect with our morality, then the antiquated moral values of past generations will loosen their hold on today. If we can all individually connect with our morality, then the next Wang Yu won't have to die. If we can all individually connect with our morality, then the homophobic narrative of the church will become obsolete. If we can, no, we must connect with our morality to shape the future that we want to see. Be the one that is so confident in your moral identity that you stand proud when others sit around you, because you and only you have the ability to make the change that you want to see in the world. But the first step to making change is recognizing what you and you alone believe to be right and wrong with this world.